Hey everyone, welcome back to Faded Neon. I'm Zach Hefner. In this episode, we're going to take a look at depth blur within the neural filters. Now, neural filters came out with Adobe Photoshop 2021, but a recent update with 22.4, I believe it is, um, kind of enhanced some of the neural filters, took away some of the ones that weren't working, and kind of tucked away some other ones. If you don't know what neural filters are, they're more or less using the Adobe's natural AI called Sensei to do things kind of automatically. Now, they added one called Depth Blur, which we're going to look at today, and it's basically going to create a 3D map of your objects, and it'll tell where to focus and where to blur based on it to create a realistic depth of field. So, like a natural camera, when you take a picture of something in the foreground and you have a wide aperture, it makes the background a lot more blurry. So, this kind of does that. Beforehand, what you would do is this used to be what you could do is go to blur and use the lens blur. Lens blur uh, is a destructive kind of blur, so it's not something I would typically recommend. Um, this one, as a neural filter, you can use non-destructively with a smart filter. So just to show you, if you have this photo, which is thanks to Andrew Price at Blender Guru, I made this based off his tutorial. It's all 3D. Um, You can download this picture in the description if you want to follow along. Of course, if you have your own photo, always works too. It's best to have something in the foreground and background to really show this off. But let's say you have this photo. What we're going to do is Control J on that layer so we make a copy of it. We're going to right click, convert this to a smart object. That way we work non-destructively. Now if we go up to filters and neural filters, we can see that they now have depth blur. Now, if you click on depth blur, it's going to take a while. It takes a little bit to process, especially since these are the beta ones. These are the ones Photoshop's still trying to try out and figure out what they're going to do with them, if they're going to keep them or not. So it does take some processing time. I'm running on an i9 with 32 gigs of RAM, and it still takes quite a few seconds just to get it going. But once it does, you can see that we start to get the blur in the background. If you can't tell, you can use this to switch off. I have to switch back on, so we got that. Seems to be focusing about like here, right in the middle, and then we get some blur at the front. So on the right, we'll see a couple of new sliders and tabs and stuff that we can do. Depth map we won't talk about right now. I'll talk about that towards the end. So we can forget about that for a second. So here you have your blur strength, which is the amount of blur that you want to add to it, and focal range and focal distance. Now, focal distance is kind of like having a camera lens. They all deal with millimeters. If you have a 25 millimeter, it kind of is better for really close objects, and the larger the focal length of the camera is, or the lens, then you can get pictures of really far away. So if you bring this focal distance down, you're going to see more of this spot right here, the front of the donut, come and become clearer. And the further you go back, it'll make more of this background table to the background more clear. blur strength, like we said, makes it more strong. And the focal range is it'll take that blur and it'll either push it back or it'll bring it forward. So usually when you get it's kind of like doing its own thing, trying to figure out where it wants to go. But if you want to tell it exactly where you need it, in the picture, it says click to edit focal point. So if I want it right in the front of the donut, I just click on that, and you'll see a point, and it'll process up here. Take a second. Sometimes it takes a little longer, but there we go. So now it's perfectly in focused right here in the front where I wanted it, and it starts to blur mid donut and goes straight on back, giving a nice depth of field. And of course, you can still change your blur strength and the focal range, stretching that blur front and back. But now the focal distance is grayed out. That's because you just set what your focal range you want it to be, so you don't need to change that. It's pretty much telling where it is. If you want to go back to change that yourself, you just click this remove focal point and it'll take it off, and then you can have that again. Now, that's pretty much it for the blur itself. You could put it as a smart filter or a new layer and click OK and be done with it. That would be fine. To go on, they kind of added a little more to this one from other neural filters. There was a haze neural filter that was being used. They seem to have tucked it away in here, and what that does is if you add it where the depth of field is, where the blur is, they add a layer of haze to it, kind of like a fog. And honestly, it still doesn't work. A lot of people had complaints about it when it was just its own thing. It was really hit or miss. It really depended on the photo, and it just didn't come out with a really great thing. Same with this one. I don't really find it, but you can try it with different photos. I don't want to click on each one of these just and update it, just because it kind of takes quite a bit of time per one just to try it out. But you can go through them. It just adds like a little layer of like mist to the background, but again, it doesn't seem to really work that well, in my opinion. Same thing with warmth. You can make the picture warmer or cooler based on the distance. Brightness, same thing. Saturation. But these you can usually, I mean, it's better to do as an adjustment layer, anyways, inside of Photoshop. Not I wouldn't use these pretty much at all. So that's pretty much it as far as a photo itself. If you want to use this as a depth map to get some nice blur on your photo, this is the way to go. Pretty simple, very nice. It's a lot better than lens blur, in my opinion. Or yeah, I think it's lens blur, because it's non-destructive. It doesn't have as many options as lens blur, but maybe they'll update this a little bit more. But for now, it works pretty good. Now, the next thing you can do is, this is usually for like 3D artists, if you want to create a depth map. Now, depth maps in 3D programs is usually better just to do it in that software, but of course you can create it here, and I'll check that on. So here on the depth map, you'll see it'll turn to this black and white photo. The black is where the sharpness is, and the white is where the fade is, or the blur. So usually you would tell in 3D, like 3D animation or games and stuff, you would plug this into a node. It would tell your render that this is where the blur needs to be, and you'd be able to adjust it accordingly. Of course, it's, like I said, it's way easier, or well, at least like better, to do it in the programs itself that you're working on. So I don't really see a need for this yet. Um, but you can also change the resolution of this map, low to medium or high, from here. But the only thing I can see why you would make one here in Photoshop is if you click OK and you create this. All right, so we have the depth map here. If I go to channels and I make a selection, just click this little selection button down here. I'll make a selection of your whole channel. Click this little layer mask tab, and it'll create an alpha. Now, when you go back in here and you go to Shift or Control D to make sure you don't have anything selected, and you go back to your original photo. Now, if you want to go to blur and that lens blur, see it's grayed out. That's because I have a smart filter here. You can only use it as a destructive nature on a rasterized layer, which isn't that great. So, but if you rasterize that from a smart filter and you go to blur, lens blur, here you'll see a tab that says depth map. Now you can change which one you want to use. Usually it's stuck at none, and there's other ways of setting it, but we have one now called Alpha 1, which is the one we just set up. And you can pretty much just do exactly what we did, except you might have a little bit more control. If you have the blur focal distance at 0 and the radius at 100, that'll pretty much set it up the same way that the depth blur had it. Now you can change these however you want. It's a little faster this way. And you can just work on where you want that depth to go. And of course you can go through all these, but of course this isn't a tutorial on this, but that's just the only reason you would use a depth map that I've ever found for Photoshop. Another thing is that new phones, like iPhones, the newest iPhones, they have LiDAR scanners on them, which create their own depth map. So when you take a picture, if you were to upload it on here, it would already have a depth map applied to it. And when you were editing it and you came in here to lens blur, you'd be able to find it here. But other than that, that is the depth blur, and I'm excited to see how that goes. Hopefully it'll go into the filters and be in the blur gallery as a new blur. It will work really well with a lot of different projects, so give it a try. Let me know what you think. And of course, on those neural filters, they have a tab from Adobe letting people tell them, what they think about these filters and everything. So go and give them your opinions on it, tell them what they could improve on, and stuff like that. So anyways, guys, that's it for this tutorial. I hope you learned something, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you later.